Pfeifer. I'm the museum curator for the Stephen and Peter Sachs Museum. That's in the southwest corner of the garden near Tower Grove House. I came to the garden last year in February to open the museum in April. So that was fun and quick. And since that time, I've been working with a lot of you. I see a lot of faces who volunteer regularly at the museum, as well as with the rest of the staff here at the garden to figure out what we can do with the museum that will increase and better everybody's experience at the garden. So it will play a role in telling stories, not just about the garden, but also about plants in general. And so just to give me a show of hands, who has been able to see the paper exhibition? That's, oh, pretty good, very good, thank you. So I'll just give you a brief overview of that process. We were really lucky to get sponsorship by both Nancy and Ken Kranzberg to put that exhibition on at the museum. It was, the idea for it came from one of the botanists in the William Brown Center, Robbie Hart, who in fact had come across unique handmade papers during doing his research in the Himalayas and thought that that might be an interesting intersection because there are unique plants used in the mountain regions there that are turned into paper and then are specifically used for the religious texts that are written by, for the Tibetans specifically, but also other indigenous groups throughout that region of the world. And so I thought it would be perfect to time it around the 1-year anniversary of the museum because, that's paper, symbolically. So I'm always thinking, always thinking. So that was one of the sort of marketing pitches too, their hooks for the show. And we've had an amazing response, and the 3 key collaborators for that project were James Lucas, who is studying for his PhD at WashU, specifically on the plants that are used to make paper around the world, and targeting mainly Southeast Asia because of the origami connection, because he's also an origami artist and he's one of the artists who is featured in the origami section of the show. He in fact did a special origami demo and training during the Japanese festival on the Saturday afternoon, and we had quite a few people come by the museum that afternoon for him, and were able to even learn how to make slightly more complicated origami sculptures. Megan Singleton is a St. Louis born and bred and based paper making artist, and she made this, she has some exquisite paper sculptures, if you have seen them downstairs as well, but she also made this incredible book, this site-specific book where all of the papers were made from plants grown at the garden, so including banana and iris and rush grass. And so that is in fact an interactive, which is getting very well used. We've had a few issues, but that is one of the important elements in future considerations for exhibitions at the museum is what can we do, what can we provide that highlights not just the botany but also the art and the history of plants and the garden, and it create an opportunity for people to interact with plants in a different way, that it goes beyond what they might be already able to do when they come to the garden here, whether they take a class or they're walking around and seeing different things growing. And then finally the third collaborator was Michael Powell, who is also, he's actually from California originally, but has settled in St. Louis and is also a paper maker and helps run the WashU Paper Lab. And he is also a designer. He created these beautiful aerial images, abstract paper pulp paintings of different sections of the garden. So he was inspired by the garden as well. So it's really wonderful to be able to work with artists who can revision the garden in a way that maybe people hadn't thought of looking at it before. So what's also really great is that we just learned that the Kranzbergs were so excited by what they saw at the exhibition that they're willing to fund a small publication. So we'll be really whipping that up quickly because the show closes on October 27th. So thankfully Michael Powell is also a designer, and so he's stepping in, and since he's so well versed with the exhibition, we thought he'd be great. So we're moving along, and hopefully we'll be doing the photography in the next couple of weeks, and the piece would be finished before the show closes. So hopefully that will be available. We're not quite sure. We're still working out the budget aspect to see how many copies we can bring, but that would in fact be a piece that could be used to help promote the museum in future too. So I'm going to give you a few more updates about the museum itself, and then we'll have a little Q&A, or a long Q&A session, as I remember in the past. And then I'll wrap up my little presentation here talking about some of the upcoming projects that will take place at the museum beyond the paper exhibition. So for many of you, I think you know, I would probably assume that you all are very well versed with the special botanical mural that was recreated for the renovation of the museum. Well, thanks very much to the interpretation staff. Morgan, is Morgan here? No, I don't think so. She worked with the GIS staff in horticulture to create a GIS, or basically, a location-based map of the mural, the plants that are depicted in the mural as part of the story map. So yes, big warm round of applause for that. So now this mural, in fact, has a larger teaching scope, because when you go to this website and you click on one of the plants, you can find out a little bit about it botanically, horticulturally, also perhaps culturally, if we've got that information, and if it's growing in the garden, where you can go find it on the map. So, which is really great. And that just launched just over the weekend, and so we're slowly getting the word out, and there'll probably be a bit more press. As many of you know, we actually are wired at the museum. We have Wi-Fi, which is unusual for a lot of the buildings. So hopefully at some point when some more money comes in, we'll be able to add some tech tools that will in fact allow people to be in the building and then reference that same map and then be able to go out in the grounds and find those plants. I tried to do that a little bit in terms of the paper exhibition, but mostly just through labels, because we did have cotton and linen, or flax, growing on the garden grounds, and of course those are two important plants that are used to make paper. And so we did try to get people both to Kemper and to Tower Grove House, because that's where those plants were grown for a little bit there. Although I think now they're, except for the cotton's really blooming right now in both Kemper and also in the Carver Garden as well. One other interesting thing is that now you can in fact take a piece of the mural home with you. Not the laminated placemats everybody wants. Those are not coming yet. We still have to figure out how to make those and make them to a price point that will sell like hotcakes. But I'm not sure how many of you would have noticed, but when you go into the Garden Gate shop and you go to sort of like the Mobot logo section, there's actually 3 or 4 items that are using the mural image. And actually the most recent one, if you'll excuse me a second. It's a little puzzle tin. Look at that. Aww. I know, right? There are postcards that have this image, and then there are sections of the kind of the cardinal, like north, south, east, west parts of the mural that are featured in coasters, and then there's also a mug in which one of these images is wrapped around the mug. I'm afraid we don't have great context information just yet on that, so not everybody knows that it's the mural, but that's what happens when you're out of town and people go to press. So we'll be adding a little like detail piece of paper there for the shop, and so more items are coming in. We have more expected. Definitely a scarf and definitely a magnet, and I think there's at least 2 or 3 other things. But what you'll also notice, should you come to the museum, once all of these things are in-house, I'm going to do a small display of them at the museum so that people know that they can go spend their hard-won cash on this merch, and hopefully a percentage of it will come to the museum's budget. I haven't managed to twist somebody's arm strong enough yet to know what that percentage point is, but I'm working on it. All right. Some of you also would have, when you came to the original meetings about the museum last year, there was a lot of conversation about how the museum would get used and potentially as a venue, because we don't allow food and drink or any live materials to be in there. A lot of people wonder why that is, and a lot of it has to do with collections management and protocols for keeping pests away from objects, because we do have actual specimens from the herbarium, we have actual objects, that the last thing we want is to have an infestation of some kind of critter come in. So it's not great in terms of then having a cocktail party, but we are actually looking to rent the museum for ceremonies. So that, in fact, we've had a couple of weddings. We'll have a 3rd one later this month. It's got a lot of limitations, no live flowers, of course, and the size is not as large as a lot of the other gardens or the other pavilions that have to be used in case of rain. So it's a very kind of unique and special opportunity. I think quite primed for small weddings, 2nd or 3rd weddings, should anyone feel the need to promote that. market. That's a market, right? Yes. So, and one of the other things is, because I'm still a department of one with no budget, I've been slowly and surely trying to reach out or, be very receptive to other community groups who approach the garden and want to come up with a way to collaborate. And we are actually, it's not to be published yet, but keep an eye out for next spring. We hopefully will be hosting a set of concerts with the Bach Society. So, which will be a first time, and when I first got here, I thought the museum was a great spot to do like small chamber music kind of era, type of performances. And it's just, again, it's a lot of limitations. We can't sell 100 tickets so cost and factoring, sizes of audiences and what's actually viable is one of those considerations, but I'm hopeful that will happen, and it'll probably continue to happen organically like it has been. People thinking, oh, what's a way to partner with the garden, and maybe there aren't other venues within the garden that would be good, but perhaps the museum could work. So, and one other thing is opening technically tomorrow. A lot of people have come to me with requests from within the garden about how do they get an exhibition there. Particularly in the mural gallery that has all of those exhibit cabinets. That kind of, if I'm not using them all for my main show, which of course, let's be honest, that's the priority, I will have a handful of cabinets that will be available or could be considered to be kind of rotating spaces for other scientists to be, to think of. The only thing is they have to worry about the budget for producing all the printed materials. And so we're gonna, if you haven't already been in the museum in the last 2 weeks, we actually just installed, so on the north side, the north door, there's two very, very large cabinets that flank that exit, and that's now going to be highlighting a special 250th birthday anniversary celebration of Alexander von Humboldt, whose birthday is on the 14th. And that was suggested by Dr. Carmen Ulloa, who's actually got a talk tonight about walking in Humboldt's footsteps, because she's from Ecuador, and he went to Ecuador to do a lot of his naturalist studies with his scientific partner, Aimé Bonpland. So she's going to be giving, I think, another members talk on the 15th of October. So if you missed that, if you missed the one tonight, you can certainly, the one tonight is at the Bayer Center, formerly known as the Monsanto Center. And so I think it's this evening at 6:30 if you are able to make it. And Carmen's great. She had a very instinctive understanding of what she thought might be of interest to people. So there's a sort of like in the past view of Humboldt, and you sort of learn a little bit about his biography and what it was like for him and all of the sort of groundbreaking work that he did as a scientist. And then on the other flanking side, that cabinet is very much about how Humboldt's practices and philosophies still influence what garden botanists and scientists do today, whether it's from mapping or testing or exploring, and collecting as well. So we should be installing the labels for that later today, I believe. So tomorrow it'll be officially opened. And I'm trying to think. So I think that's the main thing in terms of like up to date, what you may have already heard and sort of some changes. So can I open the floor to questions?
Absolutely.
Yes. Okay. Yes, please.
Are the porcelain birds always going to be upstairs?
Are the porcelain birds always going to be upstairs? If you would like to see continually changing exhibitions downstairs, yes, they will need to remain upstairs because I have no other casework. For those of you who have seen the paper exhibition, those cases that are downstairs showcasing the origami were kindly lent to me by both interpretation and horticulture, so they don't belong to the museum. So, yes. Yes?
I wondered, is there a chance that the birds, that there would ever be something downstairs like a computer or a television showing the birds that are upstairs so that people could see them?
Will there ever be a computer or television installed in which the birds could be seen virtually, using images on that screen? That's a very good question. Again, money and space. I don't have either, really. In a perfect world, unfortunately, we do have these ID guides that have those photos. I've gotten complaints from visitors that the pictures aren't small enough, but right now that's what I have. Those are the tools I have at my disposal. So I'll be honest, in getting something like a large TV or screen, I might want to prefer to use that for whatever the changing exhibition subject might be, because there's a lot that there's video captured by a lot of our botanists or our artists that might also be useful. So it's a question of how much I want to tech up the space, because in many respects, there isn't a lot of great, I don't want to create hazards for people either, if there's a lot of screens around and then they have to worry about where they're walking and so forth. So it's definitely something to consider, so I appreciate that suggestion. I thought I was going to get bombarded.
Oh no, there's more questions. Just quiet right now. There's more questions. Some of you have asked me questions, and I said, today's the day.
Yes,
Lee,
Leanne.
Yes.
If you said this, I apologize. What's your next installation?
Oh, what's the next installation? I was going to wait and wrap that up towards the end, because I thought there might be more questions.
This Q&A.
Yes, Q&A. Anything you want to ask? Yes, Jenny.
So, your emails, you send out emails, so if you're not getting her emails, make sure you get on her list because they're very informative. And she really lists the good opportunities to help. And
Yes,
I
thank you.
appreciate that because sometimes, you just think, well, gee, I'd like to do more. And so if you're not on her mailing list, make sure you get on it.
So Jenny mentioned that I send out a lot of really informative emails to get on my lists. And Jenny, I thank you for that because it is really important. I think one thing though I should stipulate, and this is what was happening, is a lot of people were receiving that information and then I wasn't really benefiting from having people sign up at shifts at the museum, I'll be honest. So if you hadn't signed up for a shift at the museum, you actually may have gotten removed from that museum group. And I'll be honest, because every exhibition that opens, I do a special training session, and a lot of people signing up for those were people who didn't ever sign up for a shift at the museum. And so I think those should, to be fair, should benefit people who regularly come to the museum. And I provide that material to anybody who is filling shifts at the museum. It's just really, it's really hard to put out all that information and not know that it can also get used at the museum. Yes, Maureen.
So just in regard to that comment, I haven't done a shift at the museum in a while, but I really appreciate getting those emails because as a docent, it's just more information to give to guests when we are on tours. And usually I try and take my group into the museum, and then if there's a volunteer there, I usually defer to them to give information. But I like having that information too, just because not everybody wants to go right now into the museum.
So Maureen mentioned that she really appreciated having that material because even if she hasn't filled a shift at the museum recently, then it's information she can use when she's going around and bringing groups as a docent. And yes, that is very good. I think what I prefer to do though, if you're interested in that, and that was something that I wanted to, I told Andrea would want to everybody to know is, I will share stuff. If you want information and you're not regularly scheduled at the museum, you should ask Andrea and I can send her that information. So it's more about having her be the funnel to the rest of you because she deals with and is a contact with everyone else who is involved with education who isn't necessarily signed up at the museum. If you're all fine with that. And many times already, Andrew's been very kind and given me some space at the museum in the Vine newsletter. Mm-hmm. And so all of that is really great too. So if that's something that you're willing to consider moving forward, if it's then at least I know how that information is going out and how it's getting used. Yes, Joe.
Could you talk a bit about what's involved in running a museum to standard? As when I've been up there, I've been impressed, for instance, that somebody checks on the temperature every hour. So what are some of the issues that we're probably not aware of when we wonder, well, why can't they do this or that, or why don't they do this or that a museum director certainly has in mind?
We've only got 35 minutes left, by the way, so just let you know, Joe. Joe asked, for me to tell you a little bit about like the ins and outs of what it's like to run a museum and the things that he's noticed, including, the visitor services associates making note of what the temperature and humidity is every hour and so forth. There's a lot of responsibilities that they have that he would like to sort of understand better, and which is a great question. And so we're going to do a little museology 101 in 5 minutes. So the Sachs Museum is beautiful, a beautiful architectural building in many, many respects, but it has many, many challenges to it in running it like a clinical professional museum. And one of the biggest is that while they did install air conditioning and heat, they did not actually install humidity control. And for most professional museums, the absence of humidity control, in terms of, what we've got is indirect, so when the heat comes on, it dries the air out, and the same kind of happens when you've got the air conditioning on, sort of pulls out the humidity. So that kind of indirect humidity control still leads for a lot of fluctuations. And there's one thing that you get taught when you're learning museum studies and you're working with objects, and that is objects don't like fluctuations, or the people who manage those objects don't like fluctuations. Because when fluctuations, particularly in humidity, happen, depending on the stability of the object that you're looking at, and each object is very different in the kind of stability it has. Say some of the least stable are paper. It absorbs the humidity and then lets it out, absorbs the humidity and lets it out naturally. And so as a result, it then stresses that object out and it ages it. Just like that putting light on an object ages it and discolors it or bleaches it or whatever, humidity does the same thing. And so we also have a little bit of a lighting challenge too, because despite the fact that there is UV film on all of the windows, at least upstairs, actually in all the windows throughout the building, that doesn't actually control light. Light damage is separate from UV damage. And so there's a lot of so when it comes to the humidity question, I have to be extremely upfront with every artist or every lender who I'm borrowing things from, that they understand that these fluctuations are happening, so that they can then tell me that no, they don't want to lend to me, or they're totally fine because they have those same problems too, and they appreciate the fact that that object will be getting monitored, and I'll speak to that as well in a second. Same goes with the lighting, because so much light still happens, even if I were to close all the shutters, like for example in the large gallery, the Evans Gallery, which has the mural in it, botanical mural, that skylight is uncoverable. So there's still a lot of light that comes in. So I have to be very careful where I'm placing things on the shelves, because that sunlight will still hit objects on the shelves. And so I know whether or not it's going to be for a long period or short period or so forth. So one of the reasons so I happen to have data loggers, which I don't know if any of you know what a data logger is. It literally logs climate data. So you've seen them outdoors on the grounds, I believe. They sort of look like little beehives. But we also have them in the library and in the museum, and they're just little digital readers. You'll see them on the wall a little bit high up, and they're recording every half hour the temperature and the humidity, because then but at the same time, that's uploading that data onto a cloud service, which is great, so I have access to that as a record. But the reason I have humans, the visitor services staff who are there every day, also check them hourly, is because alerts don't necessarily go off if there's a huge fluctuation. I have alerts that only go off if a certain temperature or humidity level are reached, either in the high range or in the low range. But if it's bouncing in between that, I won't know. An alert won't go off. So what I have found that I have notified and recognized malfunctions in air conditioning and heating systems, because I have human beings checking those temperatures. So nothing beats a human. And so as a result, that is why they're always checking. And that's why it's important for them to check that, because they will notice, and then if they see that there's a 20-point swing in any direction, they call me if I'm in the office, or they know to call GS and say something's got to come. Because that's how we found out last summer that the water was turned off from the Climatron, and that's what serviced the air conditioning system, and that it was affecting the museum as well. So, yeah. Yes. So there's more. Again, that was 5 minutes. There's more, but so you think about those questions. Yes?
What is the temperature you have normally? Because I'm always so cold there.
Well, the reason so what's the temperature? It's always so cold there. So one of the reasons it is cooler is because I need to control that humidity better. And the only way to do that is setting it at 65.
65?
Yeah, so in the summer it is that, I was told the systems could only go to 68, so that's what it was, but I think you here in Missouri have thinner blood than I do, and I'm like, oh, it's still so hot.
So it's 65 on the upper level and
and the lower level?
The whole building, but see, this is just it. Each room is zoned differently. So there's blowers in each area that are different. So they're all technically set for 68, but I've seen that it will go down as low as 65, but generally it's hovering in the neighborhood of 70. And it will go up as far as 72. And then because the way the system was chosen, and many people have asked me, well, why didn't humidity control get added? Well, if that had happened, a venting system would have actually had to have been put in, which would have ruined the whole concept of saving that space as an architectural marvel. Like, you would have covered over that ceiling, and there's really no way to, so what are you gonna do? The thing is, it's also a historic building. There's no way to seal that envelope and not ruin the building. You know, just that they're meant to breathe. Like, that's how these things were built. And the beauty of it is, every single museum I've ever worked for has been over 100 years old, and I've been in its original building too. So I'm very used to this, but it just makes my job harder in terms of who can I borrow from, what else can I have, because there are limitations. As amazing as the gardens collections are, in the herbarium and the historic collections and the art collections, there's still things I'm going to want to borrow that the garden doesn't collect. And so how do I tell those stories of the general plant stories, which I think are really where we need to focus, you know, for example, like the plants that make paper. It's such a ubiquitous, innocuous thing that we take for granted, but people have really responded to the fact that there are, in that exhibition, over 40 plants around the world used to make paper. Not just cotton, not just linen, but over 40. And in fact, over 80 have been documented around the world. We just didn't have those other 40 in the herbarium to share. Yes?
I have one more question. The office space upstairs, who's using that now?
The office space upstairs, who's using that now, it's not really office space. There is a network room where the company that was designing, you know, Florbora and then Garden Party Lights, so there's a big network room, and so people are, and it also gets used for glow, and then there's a storage room that's locked that I have access to. Yeah, it's not allowed to be an office because it's not handicapped accessible, nor accessible by elevator. And they didn't raise that elevator to the 3rd floor because it would have ruined the roof line outside, and that was the end of that. Anything? Oh, good, yes.
You know, when you had, in the beginning, you had some older pictures and maps of the garden the way it used to be. And when I was working in that building, there was so much interest in that. And I'm thinking, you know, there's nowhere else unless they go in the house. There's no place else for them to see how things used to be.
So the question was, I had some panels with historic photos and maps of how the garden used to be. Well, part of that wasn't actually my material. That was brought in as a part of an event. I think it was for Henry's birthday last summer, and it was left because it wasn't removed. So one of the challenges was that information had belonged to me. It actually wasn't totally accurate. There were actually some inaccuracies. And lastly, I'm really not a huge fan of putting information on easels like that because I think it creates a hazard for people moving around. So those things are important, and at some point it would be really great if I had the budget and the opportunity to create something that talks a little bit more about the history of the development of the garden, because I myself am really interested, and you know, particularly, and I'll tell you about when I talk about some of the exhibits that are coming next year, I can mention a little bit more, but I think that is, yes, people want to put that in context. They want, and we don't really have an area where you can get a sense like this is how the garden has changed over, 106 years. So I think that's a very good point. I think it's just a question of what does that look like?
I was thinking about your hallway by the bathrooms there. There is some wall space.
You were thinking about the hallway between the bathrooms and there is some wall space. Yes, we actually already have a plan for some signage there because the museum, even though it's open every single day from 9:30 to 5, there's still a lot of times that people use that rest station in which the museum is not open. And so we're actually going to use that as a way to provide signage that makes sure that people stop in here. I can't tell you how often I'm at the museum and I'm like, oh, please go upstairs. They're like, yeah, we've been. And so I explained, no, we have a change, it's a different exhibit now. Yeah, we've been. So I think, or people are like, really, do I want to see that? Do I have to pay? I mean, there's still confusion in terms of what they are getting when they get in there. So that's the first set of signage. We will actually have hopefully some signage that will change. It'll show that there's different exhibitions taking place. But yeah, but I think as future subjects that I'll feature in for exhibitions, there'll be opportunities to sort of do deep dives on the history of a certain collection or a certain garden that may then also offer that potential. Yes, there's another question at that table. Yes.
when you become aware of a humidity problem, too high or too low, what are you able to do about it?
When I become aware of a humidity problem, what am I able to do about it? Well, not a heck of a lot in terms of outside of just contacting general services and notifying them immediately so that they can come and check on the machinery and make sure it's running correctly. Generally, you know, it's a quick fix. There's only been once or twice where actually it was a pretty massive part failure, and so they were able to sort of kind of jury rig it to work for a little bit, but then they needed to wait till the actual part came in to replace it. So it's just a question of notifying maintenance and GS, general services, as soon as possible. And also all that data is there, you know, those temperatures and those relative humidity points are getting recorded, so I know what that looks like.
So, a two-part question. I've never been to the museum, but what age groups would you say would be most appropriate of an audience for things you have in mind in the museum? And the second question would be, what kind of help in terms of volunteerism can you use at that museum, at your museum?
Okay, thank you. That's a two-part question. One is, what do I think is the kind of the age group that would work in terms of visiting the museum, and what kind of help potentially would I want at the museum? Good question. So I know a lot of people originally were thinking that the museum wasn't really intended or interested in having younger audiences there. I don't think that's true. I actually am, I mean, I've been a curator for a very, very long time, and I've always curated my exhibitions for multi-generational audiences. But what I'm doing, the way I'm presenting the information, is that I'm expecting an adult caregiver to dialogue with the younger people they're with and generate discussion, because that's what I want those museum exhibitions to do. And so you know, that space has a lot of hard edges. You know, last week I was in setting up, you know, the cabinetry for the Humboldt thing, and a little kid was running around, and I tried to distract them with, you know, the Easter eggs that we have in the mural, and that didn't work. And then eventually, you know, you have to go, no, because, you know, knitting tile is hard. So is glass. So I think that's where the challenge is in terms of the volunteers, is making sure that little kids, particularly little kids, but I'll be honest, teenagers will do it too, where they sort of kind of start roughhousing because it's a big open space. So, but I don't want anyone to ever think that any age group is not welcome, especially since the whole point of adding that annex was to increase the accessibility to that building, so at least people with physical disabilities could make it into the building. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah. So the second question was about what kind of help would I like to see. I'll be honest, it's still really great. It would be really great for having more people sign up for, you know, to be interpreter volunteers. You know, so the shifts that people fill when they come to the museum include talking to the public, not just about the building, but also about the exhibitions, but also sort of keeping an eye and making sure that people are, you know, hopefully exhibiting what we would hope is successful museum behavior. And that happens as well. Yes. I mean, there are other tasks too, like research and installation, but right now I lucked out. I have a graduate student intern from the Missoula Museum Studies graduate program, and so she'll probably be helping me a lot, because the installation and de-installation for the paper show isn't going to be too bad. But you know, when I had a really large show and I had no help in terms of any interns, like the botanical art exhibition that took place earlier this year, which a lot of people enjoyed, there were several people here had helped on that project, and we had to do condition reporting, and we had to do unpacking, and then we had to pack that, do condition reports to close up the show, so that everybody, you know, you basically want to document how it arrived to you, so if something happened and it needs to get repaired before it goes on view, and then before it gets shipped off to its next venue, because that was what we call a traveling exhibition, and that was rented. So it's the equivalent of, you know, Rent the Runway, except in it's an exhibition. Yes?
Sorry, real quick, can you tell us how long the shift is if you're volunteering?
How long is a shift at the museum if you're volunteering? It's 2 hours. And the museum is open from 9:30 to 5. However, the shifts for the volunteers are scheduled between 10 and 4, because that was just how that worked. And, you know, I've heard a lot of feedback about how people don't really want to stay longer than 2 hours, and also there's the rush hour. For those of you who don't live in the city, you don't want to be sitting in it in the morning or in the evening. So one of the challenges that we had then was, if I didn't, thankfully, after a couple months of the museum being open, we realized that it couldn't just be supported by volunteers, and we did get a visitor services person stationed. What we found, though, much not to Nezka's surprise, but to everybody else's, that when we were not able to get a volunteer and we only had the one visitor services person, that meant that lower gallery was closed, which is where the bulk of that artwork was. And so we had a few complaints, and that thankfully meant that a second visitor services person was installed. So sometimes you'll see 2 of them during the course of a day. If they check on any given week that certain shifts are not filled, they will then try to cover that. They sort of keep an eye on that to make it a little bit more organic, but it's still tough. It's still between 10 and 4, so that means there's half an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening that in case there isn't a volunteer out, the museum the floor will likely be closed downstairs. And why would you want to do that, you are probably thinking? Because one person cannot take care of that entire building. That is a security hazard, a security risk, not just for people, but for all the things I have in there. And if I'm promising people that I'm going to take care of those things when they let me borrow them, that is how I do that, is by having a person per floor. And that's how that works in all museums.
So I noticed that, and I think it's a really good thing, that when there's a visitor services person downstairs, the gallery down there is open, even if there's not necessarily a volunteer in there. And I'm just curious, do you have feedback as to how that's working?
Yeah, so Maureen has noticed that when there's just one volunteer, they'll be upstairs in the visitor services. If there's just one, we'll stay downstairs. That's how we've sort of arranged it. That's the easiest way to parcel out resources and still make sure the buildings is secure. It seems to be working. I mean, at no point has anyone complained to me. I think it does give a little bit of difficulty. I think a lot of people would like the VSAs to literally do everything in that building, but remember, they're taking temperatures and recording things for me. They're mostly playing wayfinding help for all of the visitors that come. They will do a brief description of what people will see, but they are also counting people so that any volunteer doesn't have to click anyone through. So they have a lot that they're processing, especially when it's a busy day. And, say, for example, like during Japanese festival, we were getting over 100 people per hour, through the building. And that's really high for just 2 people, for one VSA and one volunteer. So it works, but yeah, ideally there'd be a volunteer per floor. But also, I do leave it at the Visitor Services Associates' discretions. If they feel that there's a lot of people and they can handle what's taking the in-come, out-go of what's taking place downstairs, that, if they feel that both volunteers should stay upstairs, that's their call. And so I let them make those decisions because they're there right on the floor and I'm not at the time. Yeah.
So Nezka, they sit at their little desk and they count people and they tell people where to go. We got the elevator upstairs, but they don't really watch that room. Things can happen in that room.
So you mentioned that they'll sit there at the desk and they'll do the things I've just described, but they don't actually watch that room. Yeah, that's hard. That's why I'm saying it's not ideal. It's not ideal. Really, there should be. That's why when I scheduled 2 volunteers, there should be 1 on each floor, at least unless of course there's 200 people and they're all upstairs, and we all know what it's like trying to talk about the botanical mural